Okay.
All right. Thanks, Tony.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Okay. Well, I don't know what happened. Try it again.
I was going to say it was there. I saw it.
Not sure what happened here.
That's okay.
We've been having power outages here today. So if I disappear in the middle of this, it's because we lost power. We were
That's okay. Oh, I can see your presentation.
Well, let's see. Thing. Come on. This thing is being contrary today.
That's okay. Take your time.
Can't get my cursor to go over the, there we go, finally.
You're fine. All set?
I think we're getting there, okay?
All right.
Okay, let me go back here, right, okay, we're ready to go. Well, welcome back, finally. Boy, the technology for the elderly is something else sometimes, isn't it? As I told Kaylin, we've been having power outages here today, so if I disappear in the middle of it, no aliens have come to abduct me or anything, like some people think they did the Egyptians. I'm just gone from the power. So today we're going to talk about the Middle Kingdom, 2555 to 1650 BC. So what did we learn last week? Well, we learned that Lower and Upper Egypt was united around 3100 BC by a king by the name of Narmer, who left a palette, a black basalt palette describing the event. You can see that in the Louvre Museum in France now. We learned over the next 40 years, the Great Pyramids of Egypt were built. And we learned the first was built by a man by the name of King Dozier and became known as the Step Pyramid because it looked kind of like a birthday cake with layers on top of each other. And then we learned the next king to build a pyramid was a man by the name of Snefru, who built what was called the Bent Pyramid, as well as something called the Red Pyramid. He was the first real pyramid builder that tried to build a smooth side pyramid. Unfortunately, he wasn't very good at it. But they learned their lesson because the next three kings, Khufu, Khafre, and Mankuri, built pyramids at Giza, which are the largest and the most complex, and they're still standing. They're over 5,000 years old, and they're still there. We talked about this last week. We talked about how they're the only remaining wonders, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. The other ones have all disappeared. We learned the people of Egypt rebelled against this extravagant building and began to shift to local priests and nomarchs around 2100 BC. So the people got fed up with this and they said, enough is enough. We don't want to do this anymore. We're tired of it. And the pharaohs began to lose power, and kind of the centralized power of the Egyptian pharaohs began to erode. And there was kind of a period of time starting about 2100 when the local priest and mayors of the little cities, that's what a nomarch was, where we get the word monarch comes from. That all started about 2100 BC. It's also during that period of time that Abraham came into Egypt. So we don't know who the Pharaoh that Abraham had his confrontation with. We have no idea. Because frankly, some of those pharaohs were not even recorded during this period of time. We just know, we're pretty sure that it was during this intercession period that Abraham made a journey into Egypt. Pardon me while I get a drink. A little dry this morning or this afternoon. So, my cartoon for the day. It says, well, I'm guessing it's a piece of mummified candy. You can see a sarcophagus there. It looks like a Pez dispenser. And they're trying to figure out just exactly what it was. I thought that was pretty cute. Okay, Bible verse for the day. So when the Mennonite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Genesis 37:28. It's during the Middle Kingdom that Joseph was kidnapped and taken and sold into slavery into Egypt. So we're going to talk about Joseph toward the end here because there's a lot of archaeological evidence that proves that Joseph was there. A lot of people have overlooked this in the past, but there's quite a bit there. So let's pick up to where we left off. Egypt's in a period of decline. It's decentralized, and everybody's just kind of doing their own thing. Well, somewhere about 2180 BC, there was this period of decline started. And then about 140 years later, a king grew up, more like a warlord actually, down in Thebes in Upper Egypt. Remember, upper is down, lower is up. So the Mentuhotep II of Thebes fought his way north, defeated most of the rulers of Upper Egypt, and reunified the country under his rule. So once again, Egypt is kind of brought back together. And he did a pretty good job of this. He overpowered the Nubians in the south of Memphis. He restored the Sinai borders. So he was able to kind of recontrol Egypt from what kind of like the earlier kings had done. But at the end of his reign, he was strong enough to restore the cult and depict himself as a god in his own lifetime. So he was strong enough that he actually kind of revived this deification of the pharaoh. Remember, they weren't called pharaohs then, but that's a term we use now for all the kings of Egypt during this period of time, this 3,000-year reign of Egyptian pharaohs. After reigning for 51 years, he passed the throne of Egypt to his son, Mentuhotep III. And unfortunately, he wasn't very good, and neither was his son, Mentuhotep IV. And so they began to lose all their power. So guess what happened? In stepped the vizier. Remember, the vizier is like a chief of staff. He was the second in command of Egypt. He wasn't a king. He was kind of like the man that kept everything together. Well, Mentuhotep IV's vizier was a man by the name of Amenemhet I. And he saw that things were falling apart again. He said, no, we can't let this happen again. So he stepped in and took control of the kingship and became the next king. This happened more often than one would think. Viziers and maybe priests sometimes became pharaohs. And he is a classic example. He started a dynasty of kings that ruled for the next 300 years, the 12th dynasty. And it restored Egypt's powers to heights that had not been seen really since the Old Kingdom rulers. So Amenemhet III is a pretty strong ruler, and the rulers that came after him are actually even stronger. This is his tomb, and you'll notice up to the upper part is Hatshepsut's temple. We're going to talk about Hatshepsut in a couple of weeks. She was one of the only women pharaohs of Egypt. And this was the remains of his temple. This is what it would have looked like, according to the archaeologist at the time that he built it. It had a little pyramid on top, but it was basically a colonnade hall, and his tomb was inside this. Of course, it's basically been destroyed, all except for parts of it here. So the 12th dynasty is ushered in with Amenhotep the first. He does some pretty big improvements. He has a policy of keeping well-trained standing armies. He decided that they need an army full-time. He builds defensive fortifications south at the cataract to keep the Nubians from coming north. He built fortifications across the Sinai Isthmus, which was the weakest part of Egypt, because that's where the Canaanites and the Persians and Alexander would later come through. So he built fortifications there to try to keep them out. He ruled for about 20 years. And then he appointed his son, Censoreth, co-regent. And this kind of starts the co-regency thing. Up to this point, the king would just rule until he died, and then somebody would have to take over. Now you start seeing kings appointing their sons as kind of assistant kings, co-regents, and kind of kings in training. And so Censoreth the First becomes the first real co-regent, working with his dad, learning the trade, learning the skill of being a king. And once his dad passes on, then he just naturally assumes the throne. And that, more often than not, is the way it happens for the next 1,000 years in Egypt. There's a lot of co-regencies going on, unless there's a change in dynasty, which does happen. So Censoreth the First, upon gaining the throne, continued his father's consolidation of powers and expansion of his power over the nomarchs and the priest. Didn't do anything spectacular. And then he was followed by his son, Amenhotep II, whose reign was pretty peaceful, and again, didn't do just a whole lot. So he's not anybody that we really concentrate on. Finally, his son came along, and Censoreth II, and did some irrigation projects and what all. But when he died, his son became Censoreth the Third, and this guy was the big one of the Middle Kingdom. He is considered to be the greatest of all the kings of the Middle Kingdom, and he and his son were very, very strong. So we're going to look at these two because they play into the story of Joseph, Censoreth the Third, and Amenhotep the Third. So this is Amenhotep the First. This is the first one that started this dynasty, the 12th dynasty, and you can see this is a sculpture made of him as a sphinx. They did this quite often, not as big as the Great Sphinx of Giza, but this was a pretty good sized one in itself. And they portrayed them as lions, because they were strong and powerful, and we all know that lions rule the jungle. So I guess they ruled Egypt. So let's look at Censoreth the Third and Amenhotep the Third also, because these are the big ones. These are the guys we want to concentrate on today, because these are the guys that play into the story of Joseph in the Bible. So Censoreth the Third is known by his Greek name Censoreth the Third also. He's sometimes referred to as that. He's considered the most powerful king of the Middle Kingdom. So the second period of Egyptian history that we're talking about, this is the big guy, he and his son. He was a military leader. He was really strong military leader, and he conquered quite a few people. And as a result, Egypt really rose up into a period of peace and economic prosperity. And it was really strong. The nomarchs, the mayors began to lose power. The priests began to lose power. But as a result, the king gained in power and brought peace and prosperity. So this strong leadership brought back the sense of the Egyptian nation, like had been found in the Old Kingdom. He expanded Egypt's borders south into Nubia, which is present-day Sudan, making the frontiers safe. He also made some military excursions into Canaan. Canaan, of course, is this area that we now know as Israel and the Gaza Strip and Lebanon and Jordan and this area through there. And this was the earliest Egyptian military campaign into this area. So you begin to see the Egyptians spread up into what we call the Levant, into this area of Canaan and present day Israel. He was so strong that he was able to build a whole new city called Abydos on the Nile, as well as a small pyramid near the Red Pyramid. And this was the first real king that had been able to do anything like this since the Old Kingdom, because the people, remember, they kind of put their foot down and said, we aren't going to let this happen again. Well, he was strong enough that he was able to get this accomplished. And that speaks to his power, because no other fake king for several hundred years had been able to do that. But he was able to do it such. He's also known for his distinctive statues. I don't know why, but his statues show, and there's several of them. I think there's around 50 of them, as I remember reading. And his statues age as far as his face. You see him kind of grow as an older man. And by the time he dies, he's a quite older man, and his face is always portrayed kind of realistically. But his body is always young and muscular. Now, boy, wouldn't that be neat? Wouldn't we all like to, be able to be strong and muscular, clear up into our 80s and 90s, and people would look at us and say, gee whiz, and unfortunately, that's not going to happen to most of us. And I'm sure it didn't happen with him either, but he's kind of distinctive in this. He always wanted to be portrayed as idolized, as young and muscular, and yet he always realistically showed his facial features as growing old. Kind of strange. So he was succeeded by his son, who also plays into the story of Joseph, a man by the name of Menemhet the Third. And he was almost as powerful and influential as his father. So this is the temple at Abydos, where Censoreth built his tomb and a temple to some of the gods. And again, he was strong enough that he was able to do this. And this is the first time this had been done for quite some time in Egypt, because for the most part, the people, like I said, had just put their foot down and said, no way, we're not doing this anymore. So Amenemhet III comes along. He rules from about 1839 to about 1814 BC. So he rules for approximately, about 25 years. And his kingdom, his reign is generally called the Golden Age of the Middle Kingdom. He wasn't as strong as his father, but he also wasn't as warlike. And he spent his time building things, consolidating his power and building projects, and not just tombs, but things that would help the Egyptian people. And this again is where Joseph kind of comes into this. His major accomplishment was the canal built from the Nile to the Fayum Depression, which had been a swamp. And I'm just going to show you a map here, a satellite map of this in a minute. And there had been a big swamp off to the west of the Nile River. And somebody had the idea, hey, if we put fresh water into there, we can kind of create a freshwater lake, and that in turn will kind of produce an area where we can grow crops. And sure enough, they did, and it's called Lake Maris. It can store up to 13 billion cubic feet of fresh Nile water every year, and it does. And this led to a real large area of growing wheat and other grains. And really, other than the Nile Delta region, it's the most important part of Egypt in terms of growing food. And Joseph plays a part in this, and I'll show you here in a minute. Over 80 statues of Amenemhet III have survived. He tried to build a pyramid called the Black Pyramid. Didn't work out too well. It crumbled to the ground. And the only thing we have left of it is the capstone, which again is housed in the Cairo Egyptian Museum. So you can go to Cairo and go into the museum and you can see a golden capstone of his pyramid, but his pyramid it didn't last. It fell to the ground because again, they just kind of lost the skill to do this. Amenemhet III's reign was pretty short, only about 25 years. And after he died, things began to fall apart again. And sure enough, things seem to never last for very long in Egypt. But there's a period of a downward spiral of power, and we come into something called the Second Intermediate Period. It's also called the period of the Hixos, and I'm going to talk to you about the Hixos here in a minute. The Hixos become kind of a group of warlords that ruled parts of Egypt. They probably came from Canaan. They probably came from the area of present-day Israel and Gaza and the Philistines and the Lebanese people, which were known as the Phoenicians in this area. So here is the Fayum Oasis. So if you look here, this is a satellite map of the Nile River. And you can see along the Nile River is all this green, and then it gets up to the Mediterranean Sea and it spreads out into the Delta. And this is the breadbasket of Egypt. But this becomes the second breadbasket of Egypt. This is Lake Meris, and all the surrounding area around it is an oasis where they grew huge amounts of grain because there was a lot of fresh water stored here. That's not what this used to be. This used to be a swamp. And so what they did, they connected it through a canal. And this canal was able to drain off water from the Nile River and produce this breadbasket. It still exists today. It's still a very fruitful area of Egypt. So it's been around for about 4,000 years. So let's look at the Hyksos. Remember I told you there was a scribe back in the 3rd century BC by the name of Manetho. And he's the one that kind of set the periods of Egyptian history and wrote down the histories of the pharaohs as best he could. We don't know how accurate it was, but it's the best we've got. He portrayed the Hyksos as invaders and oppressors from the Levant, the people they called Western Asiatics. And for most of history, that's how historians viewed it, that they were invaders that came into Egypt and overthrew the pharaohs. We kind of know better now. History is we've been able to decipher more hieroglyphics, and we now know it was more of one of these instances where the Egyptians woke up one morning and said, gee, I think we've been invaded. It was just a slow progression of migrant people into the country to the point that it reached the point where there were more of them than there were Egyptians. Most of them lived in the Delta area. The Delta area is what's known as the land of Goshen, and you'll know that from your Bible. And even after the Hyksos were pushed out, there were still a lot of these people left in the Delta area. And there was a period of time there when the Hyksos were kind of mercenary soldiers. They were used as household temple serfs. Sometimes they even got elevated into high positions of government. They were primarily centered in a little town by the name of Abydos. Later on, Abydos becomes Per-Ramesses. You'll notice that if you know your Bible, you know that's one of the storehouse cities that's mentioned in the Old Testament in Genesis, right before Moses and the Exodus. The Hyksos were primarily shepherds. And that's something the Egyptians had absolutely nothing they wanted to have to do with. They thought shepherds were lower class people, and they didn't want to be around them. They thought they smelled. They thought that they were not capable enough to really do anything else. And again, this kind of plays into the story of Joseph and his brothers and his father. At 1725, the last king of the 13th dynasty died, and Egypt appears to had kind of split into a whole lot of little kingdoms. And one of them was ruled by the Hyksos, these Canaanite kings from Abydos. And they ruled for about 150 years or so. And they were able to do this because they were pretty good fighters. And they are the ones that introduced the wheeled horse-drawn chariot into Egypt. It's amazing to me that Egypt, up until this period of time, had not got the concept of the wheel. They were able to build these pyramids that engineers today still don't know how they did it, but they never got the wheel. They never quite understood, the idea of a wheel using as a vehicle. But sure enough, the Hixos had gotten it a long time before, and they brought these chariots in. They also had composite bows, which were made out of sinew, not just wooden bows, but they were strengthened with the sinews of animals and kind of a glue. They also had a sword that was kind of like a sickle and kind of shaped like a U, and they were extremely dangerous. And there for a long time, the Hyksos were able to pretty much run roughshod over the Egyptian kings that still remain. But finally, a couple of kings down in the south, a man by the name of Chamos and Amos, his son, finally drove out the Hyksos. And so after a period of about 150 years, the Hyksos are thrown back out, and Egypt goes into what we will see next week, or 2 weeks, pardon me, as the New Kingdom or the Empire Age. So the Hyksos leave, but they left behind a lot of people. And these people, because they were associated with the Hyksos, are forced into labor gangs. And this is what we see happens after Joseph. Remember when Moses comes up, that his people, the Canaanites, the people that he was a part of, were forced into labor, and to make projects and things for the king. That's where this all comes around. So this is a chariot. By the way, this chariot was a chariot that was found in King Tut's tomb. And we're going to talk about King Tut in a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks now. And we're going to talk about him in great detail because he's probably the most famous of all the Egyptian pharaohs, because he was the one whose tomb was found unrobbed. And out of his tomb were just unbelievable treasures. This is an example. This is a gilded chariot, which was placed in his tomb. This is something like the Egyptians would have had, that they learned how to make these after the Hyksos came into power. So let's talk about Joseph. Now, you all know the story. Joseph was a son of Jacob, along with his 11 other brothers. And he, unfortunately, he was the youngest brother, or one of the youngest. Benjamin, I think, was actually younger. But Joseph had a little bit of a tendency to kind of lord it over his brothers. He was kind of a favorite of Jacob's. And he was always telling them he was a dream interpreter. And he was always telling them about how that dreams like the stalks of sheaves of wheat were going to lay down in front of him. And brothers didn't take too kindly to this. On top of that, his dad, Jacob, made him a coat of many colors. We all know that story. We all know the Dolly Parton song, And his brothers finally got fed up, and they said, enough is enough. They threw him into a well. And fortunately, one of his oldest brothers, Reuben, told his other brothers, we can't kill him. If we kill him, we'll be punished by God. And so they pulled him up out of the well and sold him to a bunch of traders. They took him to Egypt, and they sold him to a man by the name of Potapar. And Potapar happened to be the head of the guard around the king of Egypt. And then we know the story. He rose in power, and Potapar liked him. He was doing a good job, and he left him to rule his house, and everything was going great until Potiphar's wife became very lustful after Joseph. I imagine Potapar was an older man, and his wife was probably older, and she saw this young strapling youth, and she came after him. And Joseph said, no, I'm not going to have anything to do with you. You'll get me in trouble. And sure enough, she gets him in trouble anyway. Potiphar has him thrown into jail. And he lingers there for a couple of years. And then the king starts having these kind of dreams, and his dream interpreters, the kings of Egypt and all these other kings, always had somebody that interpreted their dreams. And they said, we don't know what these dreams mean. We can't figure it out. It so happened that a couple of guys that had been with Joseph in jail had been released and brought back into the king's house. And one of them said, hey, king, I was in jail for a guy that knew how to interpret dreams really well. So they send for him. Joseph comes out and he interprets the dream. One of them is about a cow that's withered and skinny, and after being fat for 7 years. And he finally tells, what's going on here, king, is this. You're going to have 7 really fat years where you're going to grow a lot of grain and you're going to have food flowing out of your ears. But then you're going to go into this huge famine for 7 years. And what you need to do is store up food. And the king figures out that Joseph was very intelligent. He was very, apparently was a man of kind of a doer. He could get things done. And he appoints him and puts him in charge of actually building up the storehouses of grain. So that's kind of the story of Joseph. Now, for most years, historians have kind of just said that's just a myth. That's just another Jewish myth that didn't happen. It makes for a good story, but Joseph didn't exist. Well, we know better. First of all, I have faith that the Bible is a true story. But more than that, there is some archaeological evidence and some historical evidence that proves that Joseph did exist. So let's look at that a little bit. We know that the king from whom Joseph interpreted his dreams was probably Censoreth the Third. Remember, I told you that 2 most powerful kings of the Middle Kingdom was Censoreth the Third and his son Amenemhet the Third. Well, Censoreth the Third is most certainly the king of which he interpreted the dreams. Somewhere along the line, when Amenemhet the Third takes over, Joseph is made the vizier, the second in command of Egypt. So Joseph rises up to a position of he's actually second only to the Pharaoh of Egypt. And this is what the Bible tells us, and we have reason to believe that this is what happened. For instance, the Bible describes, this is how the Bible describes Joseph's elevation to the high office. It doesn't say vizier, because this is a term that we found later. It says, then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's fingers, and gave him clothed him in robes of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck, and had him ride in a chariot as the second in command. That's exactly the description of the elevation of a vizier that we see in tombs. They would remember the Egyptians. They painted all these tombs up, and they always had stories. And this is where we get the history of Egypt, is in the paintings of the tombs. They're called pyramid text, and there are several paintings about the elevation of a vizier. It fits exactly the narrative of the Bible in Genesis 41. So when Genesis 41 describes Joseph's elevation as a vizier, that is in line with what we know historically happened to the vizier. Joseph, according to the Bible, then begins to store up grain for the coming famine. In the Bible, Genesis 41, it says, and Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt, storing up grain. It doesn't tell us where he went, but we've got some pretty good ideas, folks. Remember, he's serving Amenemhet the Third. We don't know exactly where Joseph went, but it was during this period of time that Amenemhet the Third built the Fayum Oasis and connected it to a Nile by canal and became the breadbasket. That canal's name is Bar Yosef, which translates to Joseph's Canal. That's what the Egyptians have called it from time immemorial. And most historians don't even realize this, but the canal the Egyptian name for that canal is Joseph's Canal. I have no doubt that Joseph was put in charge of building this canal that connected the Nile River to this swamp. And he's the one that built up this huge oasis where they could grow more grain and put it in storehouses because there was going to be a famine. And he foretold this. He said, this is what's going to happen. And sure enough, it did happen. The writer of Genesis obviously had knowledge of the solemn ceremonies associated with the installation of the vizier and the oral tradition of the Fayum Canal, which passed down since before Manetho wrote his story. So whoever wrote Genesis, and it's attributed to Moses, and I'm not saying he didn't write it, we just don't know for sure who did write it. But most historians, most biblical scholars say it was written by Moses. Well, Moses obviously had knowledge of what was going on. Moses would have lived probably about 350, 400 years after the time of Joseph. And so he would have been very familiar with the oral traditions about Joseph and what had happened. So this is the Fayum Oasis that's connected to the Nile River and that Lake Meris in the background. And it's a huge source of food to Egypt. And I have no doubt in my mind, and I think most biblical scholars now recognize that this is part of Joseph's attempt to store up food in Egypt by connecting the Nile to this swampland. We also have a place in Avaris that's called Joseph's Garden. And this is Joseph's garden in Avaris. Is this the Joseph of the Bible? Well, we don't know. But we know this. You'll notice over here, there's a little tomb that's shaped like a pyramid. This would not have been made for anybody that wasn't really part of Pharaoh's entourage. And I don't think there's little doubt that this is probably where Joseph's body lie for some years. Now, remember, when Moses and the Hebrews did the Exodus and left Egypt, they took Joseph's bones with him, and because that was his wish. He said, when I die, I want my bones to be taken back to, the promised land, just as God had promised my ancestor Abraham. And so please bring my bones back. But everybody's pretty for sure that this is where Joseph's body might have been laying and entombed until that period of time in this town where the Hixos were very, very prominent. Finally, this is something that's really good to see. This is Potapar's tomb. Remember, Potapar is the man who brought Joseph in the beginning and took him into power, and eventually he became the vizier of the Pharaoh of Egypt. This is tomb, and this is a funeral procession to Potapar's funeral. And down here you have the Egyptians. The Egyptians are always portrayed with just wearing these kind of kilts, and they're always portrayed as being bare-chested. They had very little hair on them. They didn't like hair. But up here is another group of men. And look at these. There's a looks like a camel, and it looks like they're wearing long, multicolored robes. They're bearded. They've got hair that's long, dark hair. They're obviously Semitic. They're obviously people that you would have seen that look like people from Canaan. And we all know the story of Joseph's multicolored coat. I can just see when Joseph finally restored his 11 brothers to power. And if you know the Bible, you know that eventually they all were restored to power with him, and they all lived together along with Jacob in Egypt. I can just see Joseph giving each one of them one of these multicolored robes. And a lot of historians think this is Joseph and his brothers in a funeral procession to Potapar. And obviously Joseph owed his life to Potapar. So it wouldn't surprise me if that's not exactly what it is. So folks, there's a lot of historical and archaeological evidence that gives credence to the story, to the narrative of Joseph in the Bible. We can accept it by faith, and I do, but it's always nice to be able to have that faith kind of shown to us as being real. And this is a classic example of it. So next week, we're going to kind of take a sidelight and we're going to look at the religion of Egypt, because the religion of Egypt is so important to the history of Egypt. And you're going to see some things that will make you understand a little bit more about how the Egyptian pharaohs were able to gain so much power. And maybe you can kind of pull it all together with what we've talked about the last few weeks about Egypt's first two periods. And then the next few weeks after that, we're going to talk about the New Kingdom. And we'll talk about some of the pharaohs that you've heard about all your life, Ramesses. I imagine everyone out there has seen the Ten Commandments, and we all know Moses, portrayed by Charlton Heston. He gets into it with Yul Brynner's portrayal of Ramesses. The only problem is it probably wasn't Ramesses that Moses got into it with, but we'll talk about that later. We'll also talk about King Tut, and I'm going to show you some photographs of King Tut's tomb and the treasures in it, and just amazing. It's just amazing that this tomb of this boy pharaoh, who was nothing, was loaded with such golden relics. Imagine what the big pharaohs, what their tombs would have looked like. So that's what we're going to do next week. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something about Joseph today in Egypt and try to figure out exactly how that story took place amongst the Egyptian people. So I will see you next week, and so long.